It was just another quiet patrol in the rugged hills for Corporal James Carter, a soldier stationed near a remote base. But what he stumbled upon that day would change his life forever. Hidden among the trees, a wild Mustang stood tied to a tree, its eyes filled with fear and desperation. As James approached, he thought he was simply rescuing an abandoned horse. What he discovered next, however, would shake him to his core. Corporal James Carter had been stationed at the remote outpost for months, nestled in the rugged terrain of the southwestern desert. The base's surroundings were vast and unforgiving. The dry winds carried the scent of sagebrush, and the silence was often interrupted only by the occasional howl of coyotes or the faint rustle of desert critters. For James, a 28-year-old veteran with a sharp mind and a quiet demeanor, these patrols were both a duty and an escape. It was early morning when James set out on what was supposed to be a routine check of the perimeter. The sun had just begun to rise, casting long shadows across the desert floor. His boots crunched against the dry soil, and his rifle hung loosely over his shoulder. He scanned the area, his sharp eyes trained to detect anything unusual. As he walked along a narrow path winding through a small cluster of trees, he caught sight of something that made him stop in his tracks. At first, he thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the light filtering through the branches. But then he saw it, a horse tethered tightly to a tree. The sight was jarring. Wild Mustangs were not uncommon in these parts, but they were creatures of freedom, their very essence tied to the vastness of the open desert. Seeing one restrained in such a way felt unnatural, even cruel. James approached cautiously, his hand instinctively resting on his rifle. The Mustang was a striking animal. Even in its current state of distress, its coat was a deep bay, its mane tangled and matted with dirt, its flanks heaved as it struggled against the rope, its dark eyes rolling with fear. James could see the marks on its body, scratches, bruises, and raw patches where the rope had chafed its skin. "Easy, boy," James murmured, his voice low and calming. He stepped closer, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The horse's ears flicked toward him, and its breathing quickened. It pulled against the rope again, its hooves scraping against the ground. James crouched a few feet away, his heart heavy as he took in the animal's condition. Whoever had left it here had no intention of returning. The rope was tied tightly around the tree, cutting into the bark, and the ground around the Mustang was trampled, evidence of its desperate attempts to free itself. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" James said softly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a granola bar, unwrapping it and holding it out. The Mustang hesitated, its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air. Slowly, it stretched its neck, its lips brushing against the treat before snatching it from James's hand. "There you go," James said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "We're not so bad, are we?" As the horse chewed, James examined the rope. It was thick and coarse, tied in a knot that was nearly impossible to undo without a blade. James pulled out his utility knife and began cutting through the fibers. The Mustang tensed but didn't pull away. It took several minutes, but eventually the rope gave way. The Mustang stumbled back, its legs trembling as it tested its newfound freedom. James stepped back, giving the animal space, but it didn't bolt. Instead, it stood there, watching him with a mixture of caution and curiosity. James couldn't help but wonder who had done this. The scratches and bruises on the Mustang's body told a story of hardship, but there was something else, in its eyes that hinted at a deeper pain. He knew he couldn't leave it here, not like this. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "Let's get you out of here." James fashioned a makeshift lead with the remaining rope and began guiding the Mustang back toward the base. The journey was slow, the horse limping slightly as it walked. James stayed by its side, speaking to it in a calm, reassuring tone. By the time they reached the edge of the base, the sun was high in the sky, and James was drenched in sweat. The Mustang, though still wary, seemed to trust him enough to follow without resistance. As they approached the gate, one of his fellow soldiers, Private Ramirez, jogged over. "What the hell is that?" Ramirez asked, his eyes wide as he took in the sight of the Mustang. "A story we're about to find out," James replied grimly. But as James looked into the horse's eyes, He couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger mystery. Back at the base, James led the Mustang into the old, unused stables near the supply shed. The building hadn't housed horses in years, but it would offer shelter and safety for the animals while James figured out his next move. The Mustang hesitated at the entrance, its ears flicking nervously as it sniffed the air. "It's all right," James said softly, gently pulling the makeshift lead. "No one's going to hurt you here." The horse reluctantly stepped inside, its hooves clattering against the wooden floor. James secured it to a post with just enough slack to keep the Mustang comfortable, but prevent it from bolting. He grabbed a bucket, filled it with fresh water from the pump outside, and placed it near the horse. The Mustang drank greedily, its sides heaving with each gulp. James crouched nearby, watching the animal closely. Now that it was out of immediate danger, he could take a closer look at its condition. The wounds along its body were shallow but numerous, as though it had been dragged or had tried to push through rough terrain. Its coat was dull, and its ribs were visible beneath its skin, a sign that it hadn't eaten well in weeks. "Who did this to you?" James murmured, his brow furrowing. He reached out slowly, letting the horse sniff his hand before running his fingers along its neck. The Mustang flinched but didn't pull away. James's hand brushed against something strange, a small indentation in the horse's mane, parting the hair. He uncovered a faint mark that made his stomach twist. It was a brand. James stared at the crude symbol burned into the horse's skin, a jagged, unfamiliar design that didn't belong to any of the ranches or organizations he knew in the region. It wasn't just a simple ranch brand. It looked almost ceremonial, deliberate in a way that sent a shiver down his spine. "What the hell is this?" James muttered under his breath. He grabbed his phone and snapped a picture of the mark, intending to research it later. But the discovery raised more questions than answers. Who would brand a wild Mustang, and why leave it tied up in the middle of nowhere? Battered and starving, Private Ramirez appeared at the door, his arms crossed as he took in the scene. "You've got a knack for finding trouble, don't you?" he said, nodding toward the Mustang. James stood, wiping his hands on his pants. "This isn't trouble. It's a mystery." Ramirez arched an eyebrow. "A mystery? It looks like a horse that got a raw deal." James crossed the stable and showed Ramirez the photo of the brand. "This is why it's a mystery. Ever seen anything like that?" Ramirez leaned in, squinting at the screen. "Nope, and I don't think I want to." James sighed, sliding his phone back into his pocket. "I need to figure out where this horse came from. There's more to this than meets the eye." "Are you planning on playing detective now?" Ramirez asked, his tone half joking. James shot him a look. "If it means finding out who did this, then yeah." Later that evening, James sat at his desk, his laptop open as he scoured the internet for any information on the brand. The hours ticked by, but every search came up empty. Frustrated, he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The Mustang's image was burned into his mind, its fear, its wounds, and now the haunting symbol etched into its skin. Deciding to take a break, James made his way back to the stables. The Mustang was lying down now, its head resting on the straw. It looked up as he approached, its dark eyes reflecting the soft glow of the single bulb hanging overhead. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" James said quietly, crouching beside the animal. "Whatever you've been through, you're still here. That counts for something." The Mustang didn't move, but its ears twitched at the sound of his voice. James sat with it for a while, the silence broken only by the faint rustle of straw and the distant hum of the base's generators. For the first time in years, James felt a sense of purpose that went beyond his duties as a soldier. The next morning, James woke early, determined to make progress. He called Marissa Blake, a local veterinarian who occasionally assisted the base with livestock. "I need your help," he told her, explaining the situation. "You found a branded Mustang tied to a tree," Marissa said, disbelief evident in her voice. "That's strange. I'll be there in an hour." True to her word, Marissa arrived, with her medical kit and a calm demeanor that immediately put the Mustang at ease. She worked efficiently, cleaning its wounds and checking its vitals. "It's malnourished and dehydrated, but it's tough," she said, patting the horse's neck. "It'll recover. What about the brand? James asked, showing her the photo. Marissa's brow furrowed as she studied the image. I've never seen one like this before, she admitted. It doesn't match any of the ranches in the area. It almost looks ritualistic. The word hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. James exchanged a glance with Marissa, the same thought crossing both their minds. Whatever had happened to this Mustang, it wasn't random. As Marissa packed up her kit, she turned to James. If you want answers, you're going to have to dig deep. Whoever did this didn't want this horse to survive. And that means there's a story here worth uncovering. James nodded, his resolve hardening. I'll find out the truth, he said, no matter what it takes. The early morning air was crisp as James sat at his desk, staring at the photo of the Mustang's brand on his laptop. The strange, jagged design seemed to taunt him, its meaning just out of reach. He had spent hours the previous night combing through databases, ranch records, and online forums dedicated to livestock, but nothing matched the symbol etched into the Mustang's skin. Determined to find answers, James decided to take a different approach. He printed out the photo and headed into town. The nearest settlement was a small, dusty community about 20 miles from the base, populated by ranchers, farmers, and the occasional drifter. It was the kind of place where people knew each other's business and secrets didn't stay buried for long. James parked his truck outside the local diner, a faded sign above the door reading Rusty's Cafe. The smell of coffee and frying bacon hit him as he stepped inside. The bell on the door jingling softly. A few patrons glanced up from their plates, their expressions curious but not unfriendly. Behind the counter, an older man with a thick mustache and a weathered face greeted him. Morning, soldier, he said, his voice gruff. What brings you into town? James approached the counter, pulling the photo of the brand from his pocket. I need some information, he said, placing the picture on the counter. Ever seen anything like this? The man frowned, leaning closer to examine the image. Can't say I have, he admitted, but if anyone would know, it would be Bill. He's been running cattle in these parts for decades. Lives just outside of town. James nodded. Thanks. Where can I find him? The man gave him directions, and James set off again, his truck kicking up dust as he followed the winding road to Bill's ranch. The property was expansive, with acres of open land stretching to the horizon. A herd of cattle grazed in the distance, their silhouettes stark against the pale blue sky. James found Bill in the barn, repairing a broken fence post. The old rancher was tall and lean, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He straightened as James approached, wiping his hands on a rag. Can I help you? Bill asked, his tone cautious but polite. James held out the photo. I'm hoping you can. I found a wild Mustang with this brand on it. It was tied up in the middle of nowhere, half-starved. I'm trying to figure out where it came from. Bill took the photo, studying it closely, his brows knit together, and for a moment, James thought he saw a flicker of recognition in the man's eyes. But Bill shook his head, handing the picture back. Can't say I know it, he said. That's not a ranch brand. Too rough, too deliberate. Looks more like something someone did for their reasons. James's jaw tightened. What kind of reasons? Bill hesitated, glancing around as if to ensure they were alone. There's been talk, he said finally, his voice low. Stories about people using Mustangs for illegal racing or worse, branding them as property before breaking them down. It's an ugly business. James felt a knot form in his stomach, and no one's done anything about it. Bill shrugged, his expression hard. Out here, people mind their own. The Mustangs are protected by law, but that doesn't stop the wrong kind of folks from doing what they want. If you found this one tied up, it means whoever did it didn't think it would make it out alive. The words hit James like a blow. He thought of the Mustang back at the base, its wide eyes and trembling body, and felt a surge of anger. Do you know who's behind it? He asked. Bill shook his head. No names, but if you're serious about finding out, you'll need to dig deep. People who do this kind of thing don't like being exposed. James left the ranch with more questions than answers, but his resolve had only hardened. Back at the base, he found Marissa in the stables, tending to the Mustang. The fox looked better, its coat cleaner, and its posture stronger. but the brand on its neck remained a stark reminder of its ordeal. Any luck? Marissa asked as James entered. Depends on how you define luck, James replied, filling her in on what Bill had said. Something is going on out here, and it's bigger than just one horse. Marissa frowned, her hand resting on the Mustang's neck. If it's true, then this horse might be the only evidence we have. James nodded, and that means keeping it safe is priority number one. The Mustang nickered softly, its ears flicking toward James as he stepped closer. He reached out, letting it sniff his hand before running his fingers along its mane. You've been through hell, he said quietly, but you're not alone anymore. As night fell, James sat outside the stables, his rifle resting across his lap. The stars above were brilliant against the inky black sky, but James's thoughts were elsewhere. Whoever had done this to the Mustang hadn't just hurt an animal, they had crossed a line, and James was determined to make sure they didn't get away with it. The morning air was heavy with the scent of rain, though the sky remained a muted gray. James paced outside the stables, his thoughts racing. The conversation with Bill had left him uneasy, but it had also sparked a determination he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about a horse anymore. It was about justice, about stopping whoever was behind the cruel treatment of these animals. Inside the stables, the Mustang foal stood in its pen, its posture more confident than before. The wounds along its body were beginning to heal, thanks to Marissa's care. It no longer flinched when James approached, and its eyes held a spark of trust that hadn't been there before. You're tougher than you look, James said softly, leaning against the pen railing. But we still have work to do. Marissa arrived shortly after, carrying a folder tucked under her arm. I've been digging, she said, handing the folder to James. There have been reports of similar brands found on Mustangs in nearby states. It's not widespread, but it's enough to raise some red flags. James opened the folder, scanning the documents and photos inside. The brands varied slightly in design, but they all shared the same rough, deliberate style. Accompanying the photos were brief reports: Mustangs found injured or dead, often in remote areas, with no trace of who had left them there. This isn't random, James muttered, his jaw tightening. Someone's using these horses for something, and they're covering their tracks. Marissa nodded. The common thread seems to be illegal races or underground markets. These Mustangs are taken because they're fast, strong, and resilient. But when they can't keep up, they're discarded. The thought made James's stomach churn. He had always admired Mustangs for their wild, untamed spirit. To see them reduced to tools for someone's profit was infuriating. I need to follow this trail, James said, closing the folder. There has to be someone in town who knows more. Marissa hesitated. Be careful, James. If these people are willing to hurt animals, they won't think twice about protecting their operation. I can handle myself, James replied, his tone firm. I've dealt with worse. That afternoon, James returned to town, this time heading to the feed store. It was a hub for local ranchers and farmers, a place where information traveled faster than the wind. The owner, a weary man named Hank, greeted him with a nod as he entered. Looking for something, soldier? Hank asked, leaning on the counter. Information, James replied, placing the photo of the Mustang's brand on the counter. Ever seen this before? Hank frowned, his weathered face darkening. Can't say I have, he said after a moment, but you might want to talk to Larry. He's been around the horse auctions for years and knows all the ins and outs of the business. Where can I find him? James asked. Hank scratched his chin. He's usually at the auction yard on Saturdays. If anyone's seen that brand, it'll be him. James thanked Hank and left, his next destination clear. The auction yard was about an hour's drive away, nestled in the outskirts of a larger town. The facility was a sprawling complex of pens and paddocks, bustling with activity as buyers and sellers haggled over livestock. As James walked through the yard, he spotted an older man sitting on a bench near one of the pens. He was chewing on a piece of straw, his cowboy hat pulled low over his eyes. James approached, his boots crunching on the gravel. Larry? He asked. The man tilted his hat back, revealing a sharp, weathered face. Who's asking? Name's James, he said, holding out the photo. I'm looking for information on this brand. Larry took the photo, his eyes narrowing as he studied it. Yeah, I've seen it, he said after a long pause. A few months back, some guy came through here trying to sell a Mustang with a brand like this. He claimed it was his, but something about him didn't sit right. Did you get his name? James asked, his voice urgent. Larry shook his head. Didn't ask, but he drove a beat-up old truck, black, with a busted taillight. Texas plates, if I remember right. It wasn't much, but it was a start. James pressed Larry for more details, but the old man had already shared all he knew. Still, the lead was enough to reignite James's determination. If he could trace the truck, he might be able to find the people behind the branding and put an end to their operation. As James drove back to the base, his mind raced with possibilities. The Mustang foal had already endured more than most, but its suffering wouldn't be in vain. It had become the key to unraveling a web of cruelty and greed, and James wouldn't rest until the truth came to light. The next morning, James sat at his desk with a cup of coffee, staring at a piece of paper where he had jotted down every detail Larry had given him about the truck: black, busted taillight, Texas plates. It wasn't much, but it was something. He picked up his phone and called a contact he trusted, Detective Sarah Bennett, an old friend from his hometown who had helped him with a few leads in the past. James Carter, Sarah answered, her voice teasing. What trouble are you getting into now? I wish this were just trouble, James replied, his voice heavy. He explained the situation: the Mustang, the strange brand, and the description of the truck. Sarah was silent for a moment. That's a lot, she finally said. I'll see what I can find on the plates. But you know, this kind of thing doesn't leave an easy trail. I know, James said. But anything you can dig up would help. I'll call you back, Sarah promised before hanging up. In the meantime, James decided to take a drive. If the man with the truck had been at the auction yard, there was a chance he'd been seen at other nearby ranching hubs. He packed a few essentials, told Marissa to keep an eye on the Mustang, and hit the road. As the miles rolled by, James replayed everything he knew in his mind: the brand, the truck, and the foe's condition. It all pointed to something deliberate, calculated. Whoever was behind this wasn't just herding animals, they were running an operation that thrived on secrecy and evasion. His first stop was a truck stop diner about 40 miles from the auction yard. It was the kind of place where locals and travelers alike mingled, and James figured it was as good a place as any to ask questions. He showed the photo of the brand to the waitress, the cashier, and a few of the regulars perched at the counter, but none of them recognized it. Frustrated but not deterred, James climbed back into his truck and headed for the next town. It was smaller and quieter, with a single main street lined with mom-and-pop shops. He stopped at the gas station and struck up a conversation with the attendant, a young man with a curious streak. Seen a black truck with a busted taillight around here? James asked, leaning against the counter. The kid thought for a moment. Yeah, the guy came through a couple of weeks ago. Bought gas and cigarettes. Didn't talk much but had Texas plates. Seemed in a hurry. James's pulse quickened. Do you remember anything else? What he looked like? Maybe. The kid shook his head. Not really. But he did head south when he left. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep James moving. He followed the highway south, stopping at every small town and asking the same questions. Each time, he collected small fragments of information. The truck had been seen here. The driver had been there, always just out of reach. By the time the sun began to set, James had reached the outskirts of a larger town. It was rougher than the others he had passed through, with rundown buildings and a lingering sense of unease in the air. James parked his truck outside a bar that looked like it hadn't seen a renovation in decades. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the low hum of conversation. James took a seat at the bar, his eyes scanning the room. The patrons were a mix of ranchers, truckers, and drifters, all nursing drinks and keeping to themselves. The bartender, a grizzled man with a salt and pepper beard, approached. What'll it be? Just water, James said, sliding the photo of the brand across the bar. And maybe some information. The bartender's eyes flicked to the photo, his expression unreadable. What's this about? "I'm looking for someone," James said. "Drives a black truck with a busted taillight. Texas plates. Might have passed through here." The bartender hesitated, then leaned in closer. "You don't want to be asking questions like that around here," he said, his voice low. "Why not?" James asked, his tone steady. "Because the kind of people you're looking for don't like being found," the bartender replied. "If I were you, I'd drop it." James's jaw tightened, but he nodded, sliding the photo back into his pocket. "Thanks for the advice." As he left the bar, his instincts were on high alert. The bartender's warning only confirmed what James already suspected. He was getting close to something dangerous, and whoever was behind this wouldn't go down without a fight. When James returned to the base later that night, he found Marissa waiting for him in the stables. "You've been gone all day," she said, her tone a mix of concern and irritation. "I'm getting closer," James replied, "but it's bigger than I thought." Marissa sighed, glancing at the Mustang. "Just promise me you'll be careful, okay? This isn't just about the horse anymore." "I know," James said, his voice firm, "but it's worth it." He looked at the Mustang, its dark eyes reflecting the dim light of the stable. Whatever was waiting for him down this path, James was ready to face it for the Mustang, for justice, and for every other animal that had suffered at the hands of those responsible. James couldn't shake the bartender's warning from his mind. It had been clear as day. He was walking a dangerous path, but the Mustang's haunted eyes fueled his resolve. He had to uncover the truth, no matter the risks. Early the next morning, his phone buzzed. It was Detective Sarah Bennett. "James, I've got something," she said, her voice laced with urgency. "That truck you mentioned, I ran the Texas plate, and it's linked to a man named Edgar. He's got to record animal cruelty charges that were dismissed years ago." James felt a spark of anger flare. "Dismissed? Why?" "Lack of evidence," Sarah explained. "But here's the kicker. His name came up in a separate investigation about underground horse racing in the region. No charges stuck, but it's not hard to connect the dots." "Where can I find him?" James asked, already grabbing his jacket. "He owns a property about 50 miles south of your base," Sarah said. "But James, be careful. This guy's got connections, and he won't hesitate to protect his operation." James thanked her and hung up, his mind racing. If Reyes was involved in the branding and mistreatment of Mustangs, then his property might hold the answers James was looking for. He loaded supplies into his truck and drove out, the dusty road stretching endlessly ahead. By midday, James arrived at the coordinates Sarah had given him. The property was sprawling, surrounded by high fences and barbed wire. A dilapidated barn stood in the center, flanked by several makeshift pens. From a distance, James could see horses pacing in the enclosures. He parked his truck a safe distance away and approached on foot, keeping low to avoid detection. As he got closer, he noticed two men near the barn. One of them fit the description Sarah had provided of Reyes Stahl, broad-shouldered, with a scruffy beard and a cowboy hat. James stayed hidden behind a cluster of trees, observing the men. They were unloading supplies from a truck, their movements deliberate but unhurried. He scanned the area, his eyes narrowing as he spotted a pen in the back where several Mustangs stood, their heads low and their bodies battered. His heart clenched. The sight of the horses, their once proud spirits crushed, filled him with rage. Among them, he noticed a young mare with a familiar brand on its neck, the same jagged design he had found on the back at the base. This was it, proof of the operation. James pulled out his phone and took several photos, documenting everything: the branded horses, the men, and the truck. But as he moved to capture another angle, his boot snapped a twig. The sound was loud. In the quiet air, one of the men turned sharply, his eyes scanning the trees. "Who's there?" he barked, his hand moving to his hip where a holstered pistol rested. James froze, his heart pounding. The man took a few steps toward the tree line, squinting into the shadows. "Reyes, we've got company," he shouted, cursing under his breath. James retreated, moving as quietly as he could, but the men were on high alert now, and he could hear them fanning out to search the area. Adrenaline surged through him as he made his way back toward his truck, his mind racing with escape plans. As he reached the vehicle, He heard footsteps behind him. Turning quickly, he came face to face with one of the men, his gun raised. "Who the hell are you?" the man demanded. James kept his hands up, his voice calm but firm. "Just someone who doesn't like seeing animals mistreated," the man sneered, stepping closer. "You don't know what you're messing with." "Maybe not," James replied, his eyes locking onto the man's. "But I know enough to stop it." Before the man could respond, a loud, whiny sound echoed from the pens. The commotion seemed to spook the other horses, who began to thrash and kick against their enclosures. The distraction was enough for James to act. He lunged forward, knocking the gun from the man's hand and sending him sprawling. Without wasting a second, James climbed into his truck and started the engine, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust as he sped away. The other men shouted, running toward him as he drove, but he didn't look back. His heart pounded as he drove, his mind focused on one thing: getting the evidence to Sarah and shutting down Ray's operation for good. When James returned to the base, Marissa was waiting for him, her face a mixture of relief and anger. "What the hell happened?" she demanded as he climbed out of the truck. "I found them," James said, his voice steady despite the chaos he had just escaped. "I found the people who did this." He handed her his phone, showing her the photos he had taken. Marissa's expression darkened as she scrolled through the images. "This is horrifying," she said. "We have to report this." "I already sent the pictures to Sarah," James said. "She's going to move fast, but I don't think these guys are going to back down easily." The Mustang was nickered softly from its pen, drawing James's attention. He walked over and rested a hand on its neck, his expression softening. "You've been through hell," he said quietly, "but we're going to make sure no one else has to." The sun was barely rising when James received a call from Detective Sarah Bennett. Her voice was sharp and focused. "We've got a warrant. My team and I are mobilizing now. Meet us at the property." James's pulse quickened as he grabbed his jacket and headed to the truck. It had been a sleepless night, his thoughts consumed by the images of the battered Mustangs and the danger of the operation. But now there was finally a chance to make things right. The drive to Edgar Ray's property felt longer than it was, every mile stretching out as James anticipated what was to come. When he arrived, Sarah was already there, her team of officers preparing to move in. She approached him, her expression serious. "Stay back when we go in," she said firmly. "This could get messy." James nodded, though he knew he wouldn't be able to sit idle. As the officers spread out and approached the property, James watched from a distance, his heart pounding. The morning air was still, the tension palpable. A shout broke the silence, followed by the sound of boots thudding against dirt. The officers moved quickly, their weapons drawn as they entered the barn and surrounding pens. Reyes and his men didn't go quietly. There was shouting and resistance, but the officers were well prepared. From his vantage point, James could see the Mustangs in the pens. They were restless, their movements frantic as the chaos unfolded. He couldn't wait any longer. Ignoring Sarah's warning, he made his way toward the pens, his focus solely on the horses. As he reached the first enclosure, he spotted the young mare with the familiar brand. Her eyes were wide with fear, her body tense. James spoke softly, his voice calm and steady. "It's all right," he murmured, unlatching the gate. "You're safe now." One by one, James and the officers worked to free the Mustangs, leading them away from the chaos and into the open fields beyond the property. The horses were hesitant at first, and their trust in humans was shattered. But James's steady hand and soothing voice seemed to reassure them. By the time the dust settled, Reyes and his men were in custody, their operation dismantled. The property was searched thoroughly, revealing evidence of illegal racing, branding tools, and documents that linked them to similar crimes across multiple states. Sarah approached James, her expression a mix of relief and gratitude. "We couldn't have done this without you," she said. "You gave these horses a chance." James shook his head. "It wasn't just me, it was them." He nodded toward the Mustangs grazing peacefully in the distance. "They deserve better." Back at the sanctuary later that day, James stood by the fence, watching as the Mustang he had rescued roamed the open fields. Its coat was glossy now, its frame stronger, and its movements free and confident. The scars from its ordeal remained, but they were a testament to its resilience. Tom, the sanctuary manager, joined him at the fence. "You did good, James," he said. "Not just for this one, but for all of them." James nodded, his gaze fixed on the foe. "I couldn't just stand by and do nothing, not when they needed someone." The black Mustang stallion, the leader of the herd, approached the foal. Nudging it gently with his nose, they responded with a playful kick, the interaction a symbol of its acceptance into the herd. James smiled, his heart full as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the fields in a warm golden glow. James felt a deep sense of peace. The Mustang's journey from despair to freedom reminds us of the power of resilience and compassion. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who loves heartfelt stories. Together, we can keep spreading hope and making a difference.